Hello, and welcome to today's IEEE Women in Engineering webinar entitled Cultivating the Art of Persistence, a discussion with Monique Morrow, President and co-founder of Humanized Internet. She is also the president of VETRI Foundation, which is building the future of fair data economy. IEEE Women in Engineering is a membership organization under the IEEE, and our goal is to facilitate the recruitment and retention of women in technical disciplines globally. We envision a vibrant community of IEEE women and men collectively using their diverse talent to innovate for the benefit of humanity. Women in Engineering strives to advocate women in leadership roles, in IEEE governance, and career advancement for women in the profession. My name is Mahsa Batagwa, and I'll be your host today. Before I turn the floor over to our presenter, there are just a couple of important items to note. Today's webinar is an audio broadcast, so rather than just dialing in using your telephone, the audio will be coming out through your PC, Mac, or other mobile device's speaker. The chat function is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Chat lets you communicate with the host and other attendees during the webinar. Use the chat now to let us know from where in the world you're joining us. Today, we'll be deploying a couple of audience polls during the live session. So be sure to check this area out periodically and feel free to participate. The polling feature is located in the tab just below the Crowdcast feed. Later in today's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. It is now my pleasure to bring you Monique Morrow. Monique, the floor is yours.
Okay, this is exciting. Thank you so very much to IEEE and IEEE Women in Engineering. It is such a pleasure to be here to talk about a very important subject, and that is, the art of persistence. And so through this journey of my narrative, I think I want to provoke you into thinking about how you view persistence in your career. Each individual is going to have perhaps a different narrative. So when you think of persistence, what image comes to mind? And this is probably an important question to posit here, is like, do you see a path ahead? Do you see ways to achieve that path ahead? Do you see hurdles that you need to overcome in that path ahead? What does persistence mean to you? And how do you actually handle yourself into this whole grappling, if you will, of your career in engineering, and your career overall? When I frame the narrative, there are some observations that I think we all need to contemplate here. One is the courage to go left when others may be going right. And we're going to talk about that a little further in this webinar. What does it mean to go left when others are going right? What does it mean also to be true to your authentic self, your authentic you? And the other one, which is probably a very difficult one, is how do you deal with when to move on, when to let go? Especially if you're holding on to something that may be an idea, maybe a proposal in your group or your team. How do you know when to move on? And one other concept here is that it's not a zero-sum game. There are no winners or losers. Everybody can be a winner in this particular conversation. The other notion, and it's my own personal observation, is that your career is not necessarily a ladder. Sometimes we think of a career path that is always a progressive path, upward or forward. If anything, your career could be not necessarily linear, but it could be moving into lateral positions or lateral, but it still represents some sort of growth. And I think we need to think about what growth means for you or for any individual when we're talking about this notion of persistence. And I think in the world that we live in, your pathing is going to be completely different. So one thing that I need to talk about is a little bit about myself and being vulnerable. One vulnerability that I like to expose about myself, and in the context of this webinar, in the context of talking about persistence, is that it's a story about me, and that is, as a child, I was a stutterer, and it was very, very difficult for me, especially as a child, to present my ideas, to present myself in school. There was quite a bit of challenges in that notion of, how do I articulate all of the ideas that I have in my head and yet not be made fun of. Fortunately, I had wonderful parents and wonderful teachers who worked with me. But you can imagine how it is when you are so afraid to speak, and you, at some point in time, are very, very, very shy. So for me, that is already a step forward when we're talking about a level of persistence. I want to pause here a bit, because one of the things that we want to think about is, at this point, in a poll question, is which of these areas for you is most concern to you in your career? Is it being heard when, for example, when I disagreed and I have an idea? Is it losing myself while trying to be a good professional? Or C, knowing if I'm valued and having a forward path in my job? Take a few minutes as we're talking about the story of persistence to actually respond to this poll question, because each one of them have an impact into your particular career. So I'm going to move on. One of the things to talk about is this whole notion of going left when everybody's going right. And I think you can see that particularly in your presentations or in your meetings, or what that looks like. You're in a meeting and it's different. We have different types of ideas that are presented. And typically what happens, and this has been my own experience and my own observation, is somebody or some individuals will start to dominate that meeting, or dominate the ideation, or dominate perhaps let's say sets of events. And what we have to think about is, first and foremost, what does it mean to go left? What does it mean to present yourself in such a way that you want to be forward in your, be able to articulate your ideas? Or maybe if an idea, or maybe if a position is taken that you're in disagreement, and do you articulate your disagreement? There are various, in my particular case, situations that I have lived where I had to go left rather than going right, where I've had to say, I disagree, and here are the reasons why I disagree, or rather than just nodding affirmatively in the room. And I think leaders need to be sensitive of the people who are in the room. If you haven't heard from somebody in the room, or in a particular meeting setting as we see here, do you actually assure that people are heard? That's number one. Are you assuring, in a very inclusive setting, in a very safe setting, that should be a safe setting, that people are heard, that your peers are heard? Number one. Number two is, if you're not in agreement, do you agree to disagree? And this is important too, is to agree to disagree. And that is I would say, an form, if you will, of going left when everybody's going right. What you don't want to do is hold back. What you don't want to do is hold back and then, exit the room, and you're very, very, you're very frustrated. And so in my own career, I've experienced those scenarios. I've actually had to experience scenarios almost at the risk of, a situation where I would probably not be promoted, or probably not be acknowledged. But at the end of the day, I felt that I felt good about being able to articulate a position, or being able to go, left when people were going right. And a personal story, an example of this, I think this is one where I was actually in an ITU event. This was a WSIS event or a World Society and Information Systems event, if you will, and in Dubai, and several years ago. And what you would probably note that I was the only woman in that picture, the only woman in the room, and it was a situation that was very interesting in that the professional photographer felt that he asked my permission to take this particular photograph. And it was being able to sit in the room with peers in the industry, mostly male, but being able to take certain positions and to be able to articulate them, to be able to represent my company, to be able to actually move forward in these particular statements, and so on. It was a personal story because it was a story of going left rather than going right. I could have easily sat back. I could have easily not stated something that was very important and stated a position, but I did not. Was I shy? Absolutely. Did I feel alone in that journey? There were cases that in some instances that I had, but it is this example of being able to go left when people are going right, and especially in scenarios such as this. I was well accepted in that particular setting. I felt that it was a growing experience for me, and I've been grateful to organizations like IEEE, my companies that I have worked for or worked at, and my peers in the industries, and certainly in a setting as this. It was very, very a growth opportunity for me. However, there are situations where a risk is very important to take as part of persistence. This is not just trumpeting something that seems ethereal to a lot of folks, but if you're comfortable, it may signal something that you have to pay attention to. If you're comfortable doing things or actually doing your work as you are, and it's easy for you, that's perhaps could be a signal that you may want to grow elsewhere. And when I say grow elsewhere, I don't mean just leaving a position. I mean taking on new opportunities. It is a form of risk taking, and examples of that where in my own personal story and personal career was, being asked to go to a Asia Pacific whilst working for my former company, and a large company, and actually taking on a leadership role in an area, in a country, in sets of countries that I was not familiar with. Now, I went, and I should have probably asked questions like, what are the KPIs for success for me? What would that look like? But I was so excited about this opportunity to take on a leadership position, and it was certainly a growth opportunity, but there were certainly learnings in that experience. But it was magical in the sense that you see here, because that's where the magic really does occur, is that you take on some level of risk, you take on something that you are may be very, very afraid of, but it's, and yes, there is always going to be that risk of quote unquote failure, but I would like to couch it not as failure, but more in a positive sense as in growth. Because there's the old adage and the old saying, which is either you're going to move yourself or you will be moved, or either you're going to write a script for yourself or a script will be written for you. And the latter is you may not like it. So you have to be in some level of control of your own career path, especially in the sense setting, if you want to call it persistence, or in the context of persistence. I once had a colleague who was working in my organization, and he basically said, Monique, I feel like I'm standing at the edge of the cliff, and you're going to push me. And I said, either I'm going to push you or you're going to push yourself, but you should enjoy that wonderful fall, and that fall in the sense of taking on something new. And it's really, really important to look to think about it. And it's something that is part of the persistence dialogue, but certainly this is where certainly the magic could happen. And in my own narrative, that has been the case. And I think it's interesting to think about your own situations of how you've had to deal with, you're in a comfort area, and the comfort area is more or less, that's fine. But at some point in time, it's looking at how you kind of think about scenarios of expanding yourself, taking on new education, taking on new learnings in different areas, and so on and so forth. I think this is a great, interesting, it goes to a previous, it goes to a previous slide that I've actually presented before, which is, what happens when you are in a meeting like this? And it has happened in my particular case, starting out in my particular career, you may be the only person who looks like this in the room, or who doesn't look like everybody else. And that's just, for whatever reason, that could be very much the case. So you have an idea, but is anybody actually coming forward to get you out of your maybe shy form of sharing that idea? How does inclusion, once again, in a scenario like that appear? And how are we actually being generous as peers to one another? So I'll give you an example. A personal example was I was actually in a WebEx meeting once, and it was actually about an engineering proposal that we were all to discuss. And one of the wonderful things that WebEx had at the time was you were to raise your hand at least electronically, and the moderator for that meeting would be able to recognize you. Especially if you are the subject matter expert, right? Especially if you're the subject matter expert. The situation was I wasn't being recognized, and my colleagues were talking on top of themselves. And so I felt frustrated, and I actually hung up. Little did I know that I would actually hung up the entire conference call. And people were, wondering what happened. And I explained to them that my time was being wasted because I wasn't being recognized in that particular conversation. Now, that's a form of persistence, but rather than being so frustrated that you stay on a call as such as that, and nobody is actually recognizing you, it's probably better to hang up that meeting. But in any case, it's better to prevent it overall, and the way to prevent it is to make sure, and this is for all of us, to make sure that we are heard. So here's another poll question I'd like for you all to think about and respond to. And do office politics interfere with the work you are involved in? Yes or no? Do office politics interfere with the work you are involved in? And I will always say, when there are more than two people, it can be political, right? And I will put that in quotes, it can be political. There are some, it's being able, again, under the narrative and context of persistence, it's being able to pick up on some of these codified behaviors. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And so on. And that becomes a form of politics. It's how you are able to maneuver through it. I will, interject here a personal, experience, and that is, coming to Switzerland. I remember, leaving Silicon Valley and coming into Switzerland, and I had to deal with all kinds of situations. Not only were they cultural overall, but they were cultural within the organizations themselves, and it was being able to maneuver through that. For example, in 1971, Switzerland actually voted to give women the right to vote. This is an example. And when I moved to Switzerland in 1990, they were still dealing with that political, at a national level situation, and it wasn't until 1994 that women were given the right to vote. So I was coming into a very, very major cultural situation, And at the time, my manager actually asked me to read a book called The Little Machiavelli, or the Decline of Machiavelli, which is actually a book on, parity of leadership in Switzerland and understanding what it means. And so there were lots of symbols that were used, but fundamentally it went like this: that you had to be married and have 2.5 children. You had to be a member of a club, or what they called in German a Verein. You had to be a member of one of the politically conservative parties. You had to have good standing, service in the Swiss Army, was positioned as the largest Rotary club in the country. And then it got very interesting. You couldn't be a foreigner, and above all, you couldn't be a woman. And so I asked my manager at the time what was the meaning of that, reading that book. And fundamentally, what he said was, you need to understand the scenario, the environment that you're in. And this has all kinds of ways that it's going to manifest itself, not only at the workplace, but also how you interact overall. And it was extremely helpful for me. And it was, a wonderful growth experience. But again, coming in from a very US-centric world of Silicon Valley, where speed is everything, to a very Helvetic world where, taking your time and being very careful at each step of the way, I had to sort of manage those kinds of sets of dynamism. And I'm very happy to have continued to persist, because I now hold Swiss citizenship in addition to my US citizenship. So I am a naturalized Swiss citizen. One of the things that you have to remember in all of this journey is not to lose the authentic you, and throughout your journey. And that's so important, not to lose who you are, not only by appearance, by the way you act, by the way you present yourself, by the way you talk. And I know that this goes again into the culture of a company or an organization, but we tend to use jargon. At least it had been the case when I was in fairly large multinational companies of sports, and you had to kind of get used to that jargon. And that's fine, because it's part of the language of your environment. But whatever it is, to keep authentic to you, to keep authentic to how you are, and true to yourself. Otherwise, what will happen is that you lose that, lose who you are, and that's not what you want to be. People will recognize who you are, and you will always be, somebody that your identity and how you present yourself at work, and how you present yourself in your private life, etc. These are only precious to you as an individual. So the other thing is, the other lesson here around persistence is knowing absolutely when you have to move on, knowing when you have to let go, knowing because that's really hard. That could be of an idea that you presented. That could be of an initiative that you had cared about for so long within a company or an organization, and maybe you're not getting funding, but you're still passionate about it. You have to be able to say, I'm going to let it go. This is also what we see in some of the organizations, of when do you let a product go? When do you need to do that? I mean, this is something that is very difficult. And I myself have had challenges in that space, is knowing when I have to say, okay, I'm not moving any further with this particular proposal. I've been passionate, and I hate to use that term, but I've been, very excited about the possibilities. I've presented all the hard data, but it's just not getting the adoption I want to have here. And it's not, and as a result, in most of our cases, it's not going to be funded. You just have to be able to say, let it go. Now, either you're going to let it go, or if you're so passionate about it, you may take it out of the company and maybe incubate it elsewhere. Again, it goes back to how you deal with your sort of growth trajectories, but it's something that is part of that narrative, if you will, of persistent. Hard area, but something to ponder. The one area that I think we don't do enough of, and we need to, is to be generous with our peers. We need to be able to give credit where credit is due. And sometimes we're not, this is something that I personally have been very careful about doing, is to be able to say, this is credit for this, the credit goes to my peer X, my peer Y, and so on, and not to be able to hoard the information, not to be able to, hoarding is really toxic, but to be able to say, you know what, this person did it, and this person deserves the credit. Generosity with your peers in the context or under the context of persistence is extremely important. And here's why. This world is very, very small world when we're talking about the engineering world and when we're talking about the technology world. Your reputation and who you are, the authentic you, will rest upon how generous you have been too with your peers. And so don't forget that. The other tendential issue here is not to, and it's related to generosity with your peers, is not to throw other people under the bus. I think it's, if you have a problem with me, tell me. Tell me that you have a problem with me. Don't tell anybody else. Come to me directly, and not to create sort of this mobbing, toxic environment because of some level of uncertainty, is to be able to come directly to me or to you or vice versa, so that we can work it out. And it may be, interestingly enough, that the narrative that you had in your head about the other individual or about the person was a false narrative, that it wasn't what you thought at all. So it's important to approach that individual or to approach whomever you may have a disagreement with and let them know. And I think that's very, very important, because throwing people under the bus is not, it's just not good business overall. And we want to have a quorum and context of very good behavior amongst ourselves. So one area that I think is very important is that your career path may not be linear. So you have to be prepared to pivot. You may be, and I give an example of that. When I was promoted to, I remember being at Cisco, and I was promoted to the first distinguished consulting engineer in the company, and I was actually informed. I was in Singapore at the time, and I remember my manager informing me, because I thought, oh wow, this is great, a distinguished consulting engineer. And the next comment that came out of my mouth was, okay, what's the next level, right? What's the next one? And this particular case was fellow, but the funny thing was he basically paused and he said, why can't you enjoy what you're doing now? This is, why can't you make that happen first, right? And so already I had this linear, I've got to go up the ladder type of idea, when in fact, the way I was pivoting was different. It was still a growth, it represented a growth trajectory for me. It represented going abroad. It represented taking on new tasks, new opportunities, new leadership roles. It represented also on being in the startup community. It represented all that, and yet they were very important growth paths for me. So your career path is going to be far different than you can assume linear. And I know that we live in a culture of where titles are very, very important, and they can be very important in other geographies. But what's very important is, remember my earlier comments, is to be very true to your authentic self, but also to learn that, to take on other new roles that are going to enhance your growth, and enhance your growth in terms of taking on something that could be very, very, nobody's looking at it yet, could represent a wonderful growth trajectory for yourself. And that has been my observation in my own experience, that your career path is going to be different. You may be doing other things from where you started. You may be mid-career and you're looking and pondering at doing something else. You may be in your latter career and you may want to actually take on something different, completely different, yet it's an enhancing growth opportunity for you. So keep that in mind, that you don't have to be stuck in this in where you're at. You know, this is also about persistence at the end of the day. I do think, and I do believe that this is in spite of everything, and I absolutely believe that it's a wonderful time to be in tech, to be in engineering. It's a great opportunity, and it's never, ever, ever too late. I think that's really, really important for people to know. And this is why I'm always excited about being in IEEE, personally, not only in Women in IEEE, but I'm actually in other roles within IEEE, in addition to the career pathing that I've been managing in my personal profession. So I think it's very, very important to think about that. And it is exciting. I do have hope in the newer generation of engineers, especially as they, especially at a very, very, very young age. This is what these young girls represent for us, and I can tell you, I have a niece who is in this space, and she's actually loves to deal with the wireless in her family. She's very, very curious about technology. When I say the wireless in her home, she's actually hacking it, but very, very curious and very excited. And her father, my brother, is intrigued by how curious she is with technology, and is fostering that growth. And that's important for us all. So we have a new, exciting generation of engineers coming up. I think, what I want to say is that your story of persistence is going to be personal. As I started out in this narrative, it's going to be an absolute personal story, and I'm sure you're going to create that story, and you're in the process of creating that story. But there are some observations and lessons learned that I have experienced, and I hope, and I'm very, very excited in sharing these with you. So the final poll question is, would you like to see IEEE Women in Engineering webinars in 2020? Yes or no? And hopefully they will be yes. And without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Monique, for the inspiring presentation. At this time, we would like to take any questions you might have for Monique. The question function is located in a tab just below the video feed labeled Ask a Question. This is where you may submit a question to our speaker or leave a comment on a question previously asked by another attendee. You may also upvote your favorite question, allowing us to ask the most popular question throughout the session. So Monique, I'll start with the first question. What is the biggest challenge for people to gain control over their digital identity?
Oh, well, so the biggest challenge to gain control of your digital identity is actually, one of the things is, once you have set yourself in the internet, you've actually set yourself forever in the internet. So I believe in self-sovereign identity, which is called SSI. And I think what's very important is to think about how we actually put self-sovereign identity back into a business model. So being in control of your digital identity in that fashion is, I'll say control with quotes, is an opportunity. I think also that you have to be very cognizant of how you use your digital selves within the internet space, and how responsible you need to be, especially around privacy is one issue. I do think that the year 2020 and on is going to be about self-sovereign identity.
Thank you. And the next question is, how do you differ being generous and kind at work from being taken advantage of? For example, people taking credit or constantly pushing work onto you.
So, well, that's the So one of the things that I think, as I stated in the presentation itself, is it's incumbent upon all of us to be generous with one another. So that's one thing. I think when people are taking credit for what it is you've done, or what it is you have, whether or not it's your idea, whether or not it's your proposal, and they're not giving you the credit, it's incumbent upon yourself to speak up. Now, I know that is risky, especially because a lot of us are very, very shy, but it's incumbent of you to say, look, this was a proposal that I've done. This is, keeping sort of a record of that is very, very important, and making sure that you do so. When work is being quote unquote dumped on you, you have to think about what kind of work is it? Is it something that could be a growth opportunity for you? Yes or no? And dumping, or where you have to say, I'm being so overwhelmed, I can't deal with it anymore, where you have to sort of push back on it. And it's okay to push back, because the more you say yes, the more dumping will occur. Let me give you an example. I have a friend who is a new lawyer. She happens to be a lawyer. And basically, if you're a new lawyer, in a law firm, a lot of work traditionally gets dumped on you because you're the new one on the block. She actually changed law firms. She was so overloaded. But basically, one of the things that she loves is painting. And she said Wednesday afternoons are her painting days before she took the job. And so they know that Wednesday afternoon are her painting days. So because she set a limit to do that. I know when you're in early in your career, it may be early, mid, or later, but it's very important to be able to push back and to be able to set your lines of demarcation.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is asked by one of our attendees and actually voted by a couple of others, is explaining a situation where it says, I don't have a hard time speaking up in meetings, but I have a hard time being heard. I speak my ideas, but they're often ignored until represented by a male colleague. How can I be seen, heard after I have already spoken up?
Well, I mean, so, and this, unfortunately, is a situation that is more common than we know overall. And so I'm glad that this question has been asked. So yes, there's situations where you are speaking up, but it's also being heard, to be able to say, and I think it's very important to say, before we leave the room now, or before we leave in the meeting, did you hear what I said? I mean, because I'd like to take it to the next step, right? We don't have a meeting to have a meeting. We don't, I'm not just going to speak up to speak up, but how are we actually going to take the, and I say global we, the next step together? And I think that's really important, because you pull people into that zone of the global we, and which is really important, is to say, what are the next? Here are the next steps. This is what I said. How are we going to recognize that? Is that something that we need to integrate into next steps and actions, and make sure that they are next steps and actions? And so that gets more of very, very key. I will tell you this, in hackathons or in competitions, I'm always going to judge on how people are presenting themselves and how they're presenting their colleagues. If I see somebody who's dominating and who is not recognizing the others, they are assessed minus points fairly quickly. And I think we should be able to do that as teams of individuals, is to recognize the people in our team, to recognize them in the meeting. And if it's not an idea that's valid, or you may be going back and forth, we have to recognize it could be or may not be, to be able to accept that too.
Okay, perfect. So the next question is, what are some efficient ways for females in male-dominated working environment to socialize with their male colleague? Do you ever feel left out of the social circle?
Yeah, this networking is a real tough one, because and it's often cited as where the deals are made amongst our male colleagues. I've experienced that also. It's where what constitutes networking overall. Is it going to the bar and having a drink? Is it Is it playing golf? Is it, and so I think we have to also create our own networking situations, but I think it's also to be able to say, hey, look, are you going to go to dinner together? And maybe that's okay, and so on. Let me tell you something that egregiously happened, and I think that's the type of scenario we have to be careful about. Was cited, but it was in the blockchain world a couple of years ago, and it happened to occur in the United States, where I think it was something like 85 of 88 sessions were all male, and there were quite a few women who were represented in that conference, and some of them at the investor level, and to actually put salt in the wound, the social event was held at a strip club, and I think it was awkward, obviously, for females to go to that. Some of them didn't, but I think and basically what they were told quite blatantly was, this is where the deals are made. And we have to think about changing that mindset in the industry. But also, I think we have to look at safe zones of where both of us, both male and female, can network, and a safe, well, I'll call it a safe zone where that makes sense. Usually I'm going to a sort of a dinner event or a fondue event or whatever, or even, whatever that looks like. But it's incumbent upon us too, to create our own networking events and networking situations. But I would argue that if we're not reflective of our society, we've got to, break down those silos and do this type of thing, networking, if you want to call it, at sort of in an integrated and inclusive way. And there are examples as the ones that I've just cited that work very, very well. And let me just say one last thing. We had an event in Switzerland where it was sort of it was this hack and lead event, which I really, really get excited about. And they called it sort of very friendly for women in the industry. And what they had was, we had males and females there, which is great. We had men and women there. But if you wanted to have, if you had kids and you needed babysitting, that was provided. And the babysitters happened to work with the kids to build robots, right? So you had and that was fantastic. They were groups of leaders, men and women, working with the kids to build robots, while maybe mom and dad were actually working in a hackathon together. That's the kind of event that I think we need to do more of in our industry.
Very interesting. The next question is, which is the best approach to prepare young women to be strong in a male world like tech companies? Is the segregation on meetups the best way?
No, I don't like to have. I think we underestimate, women coming into engineering, into the engineering space. I'm seeing that more and more. I'm seeing it more inclusive. I think the best way is to, for our male colleagues on the webinar, I think it's really great to make it comfortable for women to come into a space. I have to say one thing. Women are not broke. I don't want to put women as victims here, because they're not victims here. It's the organizations that have to make it inclusive for women. And these organizations typically have been set up quite differently, and they have to change, right? It's not the women who have to change. It's the organizations that have to change, that have been sort of there forever and ever more. If you're in a startup environment, that could be different, because I also like to look at the teams, how they are working with one another, especially when they're talking about building something. What does that inclusivity look like, and how are we dealing and recognizing with cognitive bias? So let's make sure that we don't paint women as victims here, because they're not. It's incumbent upon us as leaders, to change this organization so they're more welcoming.
Perfect. One other question, I think you touched on that, but maybe you want to elaborate more on, how did you manage this engagement of a colleague at work?
Engagement of a colleague at work?
Yeah.
So in terms of what? I mean, I'm always working with colleagues. So what is the specific question?
They ask it in a general manner, like they...
Is that being generous with a colleague? Is that being,
maybe
Is that being, is that working, typically here's how I deal with my own interaction has been looking at how we solve problems together. And, so some of the examples I do, which I think is great, is when you're filing a patent. How are you working on? Are you the sole inventor? Do you have a co-inventor? How are you doing? How are you? How many of you are actually filing patents? Number one, because I believe in that. Be a patent owner or filing patents, and how are you doing that in your organizations? Those are examples where it becomes quite interesting.
Okay, the next question is how do you deal with promotion offers solely because a woman is needed in the role to satisfy codes?
Well, I don't like that. I mean, I was just personally, you don't want somebody because of their gender. You want somebody because of their talent, and especially when somebody wants to be selected. For example, what if we were just to remove women in engineering and just have engineers, right? For me, that would be the ultimate goal, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important, not to say you are chosen because you're the token woman. And I think that we need to get out of that because this is all about how we are now changing the way we work and the way promotions are done, et cetera. And it should be absolutely on merit, not because you walked away and somebody said, well, it's because of that individual. And I've seen that backfire, and it backfired in a very, very bad negative way. On the other hand, we have to make sure too that if you are looking, you have to, as an organization or an entity, be able to look internally and look at how, what are you doing to bring up the talent? How are you growing the talent? That should be a talent discussion, and looking at where is that individual, where does that individual need to grow to address his or her, and typically in this particular situation, gaps, and how do we make sure that those gaps are addressed? There should be individual leader conversations about talent growth, and about looking at how the individual's talent is growing, but not only that, how you are going to take ownership of your career pathing too. So that's very important. It's not about stuff happening to you, but how you are being able to propose, this is where I'd like to go. These are my growth opportunities. Like I like to be able to handle X, Y, Z assignments and be very, very proactive additionally in those assertions.
Perfect. The other question is, what is your experience with imposter syndrome and how do you deal with it?
I think, yeah, I mean, sometimes, and this has been a situation where I have taken on a role that was probably the one that was very concerning for me was when I took on a big leadership role in Asia Pacific, and it sounded like, wow, this is a big promotion, right? Well, it was kind of could have been, but it was a big role, and my concern was I had a vast region. Was I going to be sufficiently prepared for that role? Was it going to be handed? Was I setting myself up for failure, and so on and so forth? So I had to actually reconcile my own uncertainties and anxiety about that, and looking at how I would address them. Each step of the way. And I think it's very easy for us to sort of jump and say, "Oh, wow, that looks really great," which is part of the narrative, right? It's part of growing yourself into uncomfortable spaces. But it's when I always say, be careful what you ask for, but in the sense of be cautious. And cautious means, yes, it has the allure. Yes, it's a growth opportunity. But ask the questions of what are going to be my measures and metrics for success, and how does the organization view that? And if I need to ask for help, can I ask for help? And in this particular case, I did. because I didn't want to take on the shoulders, and being able to say, if by asking for help, is that a sign of weakness? In fact, that's what was expected of me, and I'm glad I did. And in this case, it was for additional resources.
Amazing. We have another question about, have you ever felt tension between leading the young male peers and your own?
No, not at all. Not in my personal experience. No. In fact, it's again, it depends. I've never, you know, in fact, in my own experiences about how we're solving problems together, and being very conscious about the goals that we want to achieve, and so on. So I've never have been in that even when I had quote unquote male reports and so on. It was never an issue for me.
Okay, I'll ask one last question. We have so many questions here, but we may not have enough time to cover all. This is a very interesting one. So how do you deal with our tendency to know everything on the job description to apply, while male do apply even with the meeting of 30% of the qualifications, not maybe 100% of it?
Well, I mean, look, and I have male colleagues, and they're just as nervous and about applying for a position. But I think there is more about, if I get at least 30% or 20, I can grow into that role. And I think it is true. We want to be 100%. We want to check off 100% of everything. And let me just tell you, you're never going. You may achieve 100%, but I would tell you that it's probably better to take on, if that role appeals to you. Start that discussion that way. If it appeals to you, and you believe it's a growth opportunity for you, and you can do it, why not try it? Try for it. Rather than holding yourself back, and regretting that perhaps somebody, quote unquote, who appeared to be less qualified got the role. It's all about, remember what I said, it's all about jumping into the space that you may not be comfortable for, but being able to say, okay, I think I can take that on. I think I can grow into it, and having that level of internal confidence to do that. And maybe somewhere along the way you'll have to say, I need this and this and this, but be able to negotiate and talk about, most importantly, what are your success factors? How are you going to be measured for success at the end of the day?
Thank you, Monique, for the very inspiring and interesting presentation and discussion. And thank you for our attendees to joining us today. This webinar will be available on demand next week. To access the on-demand version, please visit wie.ieee.org. We invite you to join IEEE Women in Engineering by visiting wieee.org/membership. We also encourage you to participate in the IEEE Women in Engineering International Leadership Conference taking place on 19th and 20th of May 2020 in San Diego, USA. For more information, please visit IEEE-wie-ilc.org. This concludes our webinar. You may now disconnect. Have a great day, everyone.